And our first speaker is going to be Christian Catalini, and he will be talking about seeding the S curves and early adopters and so on. Please. Yeah.
Nick, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks also for the support for our research. This is joint work with Catherine Tucker, also at MIT. I want to give you kind of a preview of the main results, just in case I run out of time, but also spend a few minutes on the underlying technology, because I think it's something that should be of interest to many people in the room that care about networks and kind of market structure and market power. So this paper really focuses on the diffusion of an innovation. And there's an extensive literature in innovation around S-curves. In fact, those are probably one of the most stylized facts on which different social science disciplines agree on, from marketing to sociology to economics. They do agree on the shape of the diffusion curve. They don't agree on the mechanism, right? So there's many competing interpretation of why we see that diffusion curve. You're all familiar with economic models, which essentially focus on marginal benefits, marginal cost, and kind of as cost of adoption drop down, people find optimal to enter in. You can get the same with kind of different attitudes towards risk and different preferences. And of course, then network externality is playing a role in accelerating that. On the sociology side, there's much more attention on kind of an epidemic model where word of mouth and kind of observational learning, if you want to think about it in economic terms, plays a much bigger role in our decision to adopt or not. And you will see that in this paper, we're kind of horse racing a little bit these two theories without kind of finding one more important than the other. We'll find some evidence for both, and maybe we'll be able to reconcile some of the controversy on that. I think one of the main challenges of studying diffusion curves in innovation is that we never get to observe a counterfactual diffusion curve, right? So even in Zvi Grilich's seminal study on hybrid corn, we see the different states adopting over time and how diffusion within state changes, but we never know what would have happened if, let's say, Texas had adopted first, right? So if you think about a natural experiment or some sort of exogenous variation in that. And what we will be able to do in this setting is actually we will be able to introduce some of that exogenous variation. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. The research question we're focused on is really this basic idea of what happens to that technology diffusion curve when the natural order is perturbed. And by natural order, you should think about the classic sequence where early adopters come up first, either because they have better preferences for that technology or because they get better benefit. And we'll have a setting where we'll be able to kind of change that sequence and see kind of how events unfold from there. The setting will be the MIT digital currency experiment, which is now 2 years old. So in 2014, MIT gave access to all of its undergraduate students to Bitcoin. I'll tell you a bit more about that. And we have really rich data on student level decisions to adopt, disadopt, convert Bitcoin back into cash, their usage. And our identification strategy will be fairly straightforward, and that's why I will show you mostly raw means. We have regression tables too with a bunch of controls, but essentially we'll be randomly delaying half of the sample by 2 weeks and looking kind of how that plays out in terms of adoption. So what do we find? First of all, that when natural early adopters are kind of delayed, and I'll explain how we identify them, they're way more likely to abandon the technology. This is was counterintuitive to us at first when we saw the result, but they seem to care about that exclusivity period. And once we rule out a bunch of alternative explanations like learning and pure effects and some of the usual suspects, it turns out that most of the mechanism seems to be linked to their reputation, to the role they play within their network of friends. So it seems to be sort of an identity story, but one way you can think of it as a consumption utility story. So there's people that value early access first. Think about the people that line up in the Apple store when there's a new launch, or wake up at midnight or 3 a.m. if you're on the East Coast to get the new iPhone. And it's optimal for firms to serve them first because, again, they generate positive spillovers potentially on adoption by their peers. What we see, in fact, is that when in settings where an above the median share of early adopters was randomly delayed, this adoption is much faster. We'll be kind of playing the reverse game here because we start with full saturation. Almost 100% of our students will get Bitcoin, and then we'll look at people that essentially decide to disadopt over time. And if you look at activity, 500 days into the randomized experiment, you have a 45% gap in activity in terms of people that were, where the seeding of the technology was optimal versus cases where early adopters were kind of kept in the dark for 2 weeks. I want to spend literally 1 or 2 minutes to tell you a bit more about blockchain and kind of the technology that allows us to do a lot of the empirics here. We have a new piece on the economics of this technology, mostly to clear out a lot of the hype that you may have seen in the press, so bringing it back to basic cost. You may have heard a lot about Bitcoin. Bitcoin is kind of the first implementation at scale of blockchain technology. What is a blockchain? Is essentially a chain of blocks, like the name suggests. And what's interesting is that these blocks can be very flexible containers for transactions and their attributes. And I want you to think about transaction in the most general way possible. Every time you authenticate yourself to a service, you buy and sell goods, you buy digital goods, you're essentially creating a transaction, and that carries some attributes. Why is this chain particularly useful? It's because through a clever mix of game theory and cryptography, it becomes an immutable audit trail over time in a totally distributed fashion. So here you have a technology that has the right incentives for a network to emerge where there isn't one, and where you don't have essentially trusted nodes. Think about the banking system, where every bank is kind of a trusted node in keeping a public ledger. So this is essentially a giant public ledger that will record things, IP and other things, contracts in the future. Why I think economists should care is because essentially you're assisting, for the first time in history, I think we're lowering the cost of verification almost to zero. Cost is never going to be zero, but when you think about verifying attributes in a ledger or between systems or between firms, there's always the cost of eventually performing an audit. When a transaction goes wrong, you go back, you need to verify the credentials of the parties involved, you need to verify the provenance of the goods, the quality of the goods, or whatever. If you're able to store them in this distributed ledger, you can perform that verification practically at zero cost. This is what allows Bitcoin to transfer value from here to anywhere in the world within minutes, practically at zero cost. With this comes also this idea of a crypto token. Many are trying to separate Bitcoin from blockchain. That's kind of a false statement, because what allows the Bitcoin network to be a distributed network is the incentives. And the incentives come from the underlying cryptocurrency. What's interesting here is that you can very much bootstrap a platform without an intermediary. You can design the protocol in a way that will create incentive for matching demand and supply. Think about Uber drivers, right? Uber is a giant reputation system plus a payment rail. With a cryptocurrency, you can first automate the payment system, but you can also keep track of the reputation system. So suddenly you can disintermediate a platform. Of course, you still need to certify drivers. I mean, there's still added value to be done on that part of the market, but a lot of it gets commodified. So lots of implication for market design, and I think that's kind of the most interesting part for economists. Also in terms of how do we do public good provisions? How do we think about regulation and antitrust in sectors where we do want platforms, but we don't want market power necessarily to emerge? There's many different use cases. I won't have time to really spend on this. Most of the central banks, I mean, there's Hannah here in the room, I've been thinking hard about this problem, and some of them are seriously considering bringing their currency in a cryptocurrency form. This changes monetary policy, changes how you think about taxation. It's actually a very interesting technology for a number of reasons, but I mean, it's going to take a few years to unfold. It's kind of gathered the mainstream, but I want you to project back 2 years ago. So this was 2014. The IRS considered Bitcoin property, lots of uncertainty on what it was, a lot of worries around this experiment. And this is when two of our students essentially raised $500,000 from alumni to give everybody access to Bitcoin. We came in mostly to make the experiment safe and to ensure that even if everybody had cashed out the next morning, which was a reasonable assumption given that there wasn't that much utility in Bitcoin at that point, we could learn something. Relative to your classic randomized control trial, this is a trial at scale. So we have about 5,000 students in the sample. We had to, well, IRB was a nightmare, but we also had to talk to the IRS, to the Treasury, counterterrorism financing, believe it or not, the Fed, mostly because, again, Bitcoin in 2014 was considered still the realm of online drug dealers and gambling. Also, the students that raised the money, so they were kind of in charge, and that will limit what we were able to randomize. And hopefully some of the randomization, as you will see, were useful. Also, not much of a compelling use case, especially in a developed country where you have lots of payment options. And we were only seeding one side of the market, right? So we were focused on the students. We didn't do anything on the merchants. That would have to happen on its own. Of course, questions about generalizability. If anything, this is MIT, right? So if there's one place in the world where this should work, it should be there, right? You would imagine the average nerds being the kind of people attracted to this. And most of the bias likely will work against us, as you will see once I show you the results. Another interesting point, of course, security. When we did this, a number of foreign governments were really worried about Bitcoin. And so we had to step up all the security around this. Our own students tried to hack us, but that was something that we had planned for. But consider like an environment where many of our choices were kind of limited by the constraints of the setting. Today I'm going to focus only on one randomization, which is the timing of the distribution. 50% of our students got Bitcoin right away, and 50% was delayed by 2 weeks. That's as much as we could bargain with the students. We couldn't, vary the amounts. We couldn't do a number of other stuff. We have another paper where we look really at digital privacy and choices that people make between convenience, security, and kind of their online financial data, but I'm not going to talk about that today. 2 data points from our extensive survey when students come up, kind of signing up for the project. Even at MIT, only 6% defined themselves as very or extremely familiar with Bitcoin in 2014. So it was still very niche. The other interesting point is that most of them were attracted to Bitcoin as an investment. Now, when I saw that answer in 2014, I was like, okay, all our materials about how this is a terrible investment asset, it's really volatile, you should not put your savings in it, didn't help. But it turns out that we distributed at 350, and well, this is a few days ago, 760. So the students weren't absolutely wrong about that. And with the global turmoil and macroeconomic uncertainty, I think that's only bound to go higher. But what's interesting, think of it as a technology where one of the leading use cases is actually holding it as an investment. So holding is kind of an adoption choice to some extent. 70% of the students participated. We weren't even allowed to reveal because of the IRB that they would get $100 unless they consented. The vast majority is still holding their Bitcoin, and this has been after price changes. Original cash out was only 11%. After the price kind of went over the original amount, once they were $50 or $100 in, some people started cashing in on those gains. Activity is really low. Right, so these are more like, there's some people that are extremely active, very much like in the bandwidth peak data, but think about it between 20 and 12%, depending on how you want to define the variable. This is kind of a screenshot of our dorms. Darker green is more active. You can see kind of all the MIT dorms, and these are some of the students off campus. We don't really have a control group. One idea was to repeat at Stanford. That fell apart. But here you're seeing that the degree of transactions per week went from about, I think, 50 transactions per week to about 100. So still very small volumes, even at MIT. So to address kind of the research question that I started with, which is what happens when the natural order of adoption is perturbed, we need 3 things. So there's 3 empirical challenges. The first one is that you need fine-grained information about adoption or disadoption choices. The second one is that we do need a way to identify natural early adopters before we seed the technology to the population of interest, right? So otherwise, how do we build that kind of counterfactual? And then we need exogenous variation in the adoption sequence. That's easy, right? So that comes from the randomization. The blockchain, that ledger, becomes the key for that fine-grained information. So we're going to do some machine learning and get data from financial intermediaries to really reconstruct everything that happened with those initial dollars. What we do for the natural early adopters is a reveal preference approach. So essentially, we take people with the speed at which they sign up. Think of it, there was this waiting list, and we're going to take the top X%, and that's going to be what we define as early adopters. It's robust to using survey measures. So you can correlate it with things that people say about themselves and technology choices, especially on financial products and financial tools like Venmo. And it's very consistent with what you would expect. Now, We're going to focus on disadoption, which is very peculiar here, also because it has an upside. So typically, when you think of disadoption, there's not necessarily a gain. But here, if you abandon, you get dollars, right? So that's kind of different. What's reassuring is that whether you prefer the review, the tracking that we do through the data or what we ask them in the survey, the measure doesn't seem to be biased in any way with respect to how it captures behavior by early adopters versus not. The waiting list is actually quite successful in I think pinning down the early adopters, and it's very similar to what technology companies use all the time, like in the case of Google Glass or Mailbox, to identify the people that really want the technology the most. If you look at our top 25% of the waiting list, they're way more likely to be top coders, to have released an app in iOS or Android, to regularly use PayPal or Square Cash for daily peer-to-peer payments, right? So many of us will use PayPal for payments, but few of us will probably use it for peer-to-peer payments, so to paying for a friend. And ironically, as you would expect, they place a lot of trust in a tech firm or a startup, much less in a financial service, traditional financial service firm or even a bank. The exogenous variation comes from, again, dividing the sample into people that will get it right away and people will get it by 2 weeks. Nobody was told when they would receive their Bitcoin. After the sign up, there was just information that it would be rolled out in the near future. What that gives us is that some of our natural early adopters will be delayed. Right? So that's kind of the exogenous variation, and that's our main result. When you look at the top 25% of the waiting list, they're almost twice as likely to cash out when they're delayed. Rest of regular students essentially don't care about those 2 weeks delay. It was, after all, a really short delay. I mean, we can put this in a more classic regression framework, throwing in a bunch of controls, controlling for our other randomizations, student characteristics, preferences, a number of things. Result is really robust. So these are logits odds ratio, so it's about a 2x based to the baseline. And the rest of the variables are very much what you would expect. People that chose a bank-like wallet, so something that looks like Venmo, it's really intuitive to use, even with Bitcoin, less likely to cash out. People that expected the price to go down, more likely to cash out. Interestingly, our main effect doesn't count for people that already have Bitcoin, which is a useful falsification. And if you're worried about our definition of kind of the cash out window, we can kind of move it around, extend it, give the second cohort more time than the first. It doesn't really make a difference. Changing functional form, same result. But let me show you some of the alternative explanation that we can sort of rule out relatively quickly. So the first one is not that they needed the money the most, right? You may imagine that people that rushed to sign up just wanted $100. When we split by above the median versus below the median cash in their wallet, not much of a difference. Financially independent, right, versus not much of a difference. So that doesn't seem to be kind of an explanation. We can throw out anybody that used Bitcoin before, both based on the survey and our own kind of machine learning on their data transaction. The result gets actually stronger. You may think that early adopters had learned more in those 2 weeks relative to their peers, right? So maybe they figured that the price would keep going down or something like that. They don't cash out at better prices than the others, and they don't update their preferences and expectations about the currency in a different way than the others, right? You would still have to explain why the original cohort of early adopters doesn't cash out. But even if you believe that the second cohort sort of learned more, we don't find it in the data. We also don't see any preference for risk being different between the two sets. Do you think Bitcoin is an attractive investment? Like how risk averse are you? Do you want deposit insurance or your Bitcoins versus not? Again, the classic explanation here don't seem to work. This is just the regression version of this. And like I mentioned before, if you're not new to Bitcoin, the effect is not there, right? Because essentially you already have the technology anyway, and we wouldn't expect it to be there. So what's the mechanism about? So here's a few clues. The first one is that the effect is only coming from environments where the students are highly socialized, the dorms. And interestingly, it's stronger when dorms are more small. So where my delay may be very visible to my peers because we're essentially within the same environment. It's just the same thing in a regression. Where the story gets interesting is that the more unique you are as a technology leader, as a technology gatekeeper among your peers, the stronger the effect. So actually in an environment where there's a below the median share of computer scientists, we do see a really strong effect. Now this is consistent also with learning, right? So if you delay the people that know the technology, can help others the most, of course you'll damage kind of further adoption. By the time the early adopters get it, everybody has cashed out. Turns out that we can rule that one out too. We have some settings where everybody was delayed, and even when everybody is delayed, the early adopters kind of have this behavior of abandoning the technology. When nobody is delayed, they don't care. So there's something about how they're benchmarking themselves against their peers that really matters in this context. Some suggestive evidence on the spillovers. So these are kind of these adoption curves going from 100% to about 60%, 250 days into the experiment. You see that most groups, so this is just by group, the blue line is early adopters that were delayed. And they're the ones that really abandon at a much faster rate. Now what we can do is take them out and look at the others, right? So did they influence some of their peers potentially because of their original decision to disadopt? The way we implement the randomization here is by splitting, in this case, dorms by above the median versus below the median share of early adopters that were delayed. And you can see that in settings where we essentially didn't see the technology optimally, the disadoption rate is much faster. Moreover, if I zoom in on dorm floors, the two curves start departing much earlier, right? So where it's potentially much more visible. To others, even bigger effects when we look at small dorms again. So in small dorms, the fact that these people were delayed induces that very, very fast disadoption. If you flip it in terms of activity, here we take the most conservative measure of activity. Do you keep kind of adding substantial amounts of funds? It's about a 45% delta between dorms where you kind of seeded the technology by giving early adopters early access to cases where you did not. So number of limitations, of course, in a very idiosyncratic setting. We're studying a very peculiar part of the diffusion curve. We could only bargain 2 weeks, right? So it's a really small delay, same amounts too. If anything, dorms are highly socialized environments. So if you think about generalizability in the consumer setting, I would imagine people are less socialized than the life of a regular college student at that age. And also abandonment is unusual here because you always get cash, right? So whenever you abandon, you get something. So to summarize, what we find is that when you delay early adopters, you increase the likelihood that they will abandon. There seems to be spillovers of this effect on their peers. And the way we've rationalized it at this point, but I love your comments and ideas, is that there's some consumption utility from that exclusivity period, which is very much consistent also in I/O models where you have a monopolist trying to kind of price discriminate between people with different willingness to pay. The optimal seeding technology actually does give early access to these individuals, but it's not for the traditional reasons. Often we think of these as technological reasons, right? So these are the people that can teach others. Here it seems like their positive network externality comes with a price, which is they do want to be first. This happens mostly when we teach to MBAs, which is like you talk about the diffusion process as something that you can strategize around, that you can kind of managerially optimize. If anything, these results show that economists are right. There's a natural order to a diffusion curve, and when you try to really accelerate it or perturb it, it may actually backfire. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, our discussant is Feng Zhu from Harvard Business School.
Thanks so much for the opportunity to discuss this paper. I actually was a discussant for an early version of this paper a few months back. Yeah, so it's great to receive the invitation to discuss this paper again, because initially I thought I could reuse most of my comments, but it turns out that the authors have addressed all my concerns in the current version, right? So, so as a result, I had to come up with new comments. Actually, it's actually a lot harder to do that. Yeah, and I actually like the first version of the paper a lot already, right? So this version is actually much, much better. And so I'm very grateful that the authors have done such a great revise and resubmit to the discussant. So, as a result, my discussion will be brief, right? Just to quickly summarize, right? So I think this is a really awesome paper, right? It's a great academic paper around the Bitcoin, right? Even though it's just a setting, but it's a very interesting one, and I learned a lot about Bitcoin itself and also the experiment, right? And it's experiment together with lots of survey data as well, right? So you can actually verify many of the patterns, right? You discovered through regression analysis, right? And also it's a very big experiment, right? With more than 3,000 undergraduates at MIT, and also it's an expensive one, right? $100 each, right? Worth of Bitcoin each, right? So my immediate suggestion is that in the future, if you run these experiments, please also include the professors in Boston, right? So, and the message is also very clear, right? Early adopters, right, can also be an obstacle to diffusion, right? So if you try to see the technology while ignoring, right, these early adopters' needs for distinctiveness, right, that practice might be counterproductive, right? And the paper also has a rich set of analysis, right? So the benefit of doing experiment in a university is that the authors can get lots of data from the university, right? To get help on like understanding their demographics, understanding their dorm assignments, essentially the underlying social network, right? Understanding their majors, etc. Right? You get all this data, right? So it's also possible to go back to these students and ask for additional information, right? So this is a really great setting, right, for doing experiments and discovering some new results, right? So I do have a few more suggestions, right? These suggestions tend to be quite minor, so feel free to ignore them, right? The paper is already extremely good, right? So I guess like some people might feel like, okay, is the cashing out right here about equivalent to rejecting the technology, or can we actually argue that cash out is actually embracing, actually using the technology, right? It's like if I give you a free email account and you never use it, right? Is this about, are we saying that you're actually using the technology or not, right? So, especially in the case of a Bitcoin, I feel like if you ask me what are the potential options for using Bitcoin, I would say just buy and sell it, right? Because it's difficult for me to think of scenarios where I actually need to use Bitcoin for physical goods, right? I can't use Bitcoin, for instance, on Amazon.com, I can't use Bitcoins in my local in local restaurants, right? So I mean, so maybe these people who are actually cashing out, right? They're actually embracing the technology, right? They're actually trying out the technology to some extent, right? So the story might be, right? If you take that argument, the story might be the longer you let some of the early adopters wait, and the more eager they actually want to try out the technology as a result later on, right? So it might be useful to look into this a little bit, right? And related to that, right? So what about the other uses of Bitcoins? You do show that there are some active uses of Bitcoins for a small set of the participants in these experiments here, right? So the idea here is that are delayed users more or less likely to use Bitcoins to purchase products online or not, right? In addition to cashing out, can we look at their like other usage of Bitcoins, right? To basically find more consistent pattern whether they are actually embracing the technology or they are abandoning the technology. Right? And the paper tries to talk about this like a mechanism through this identity lens, right? But I just wonder is like some kind of disappointment, right? Because the process is not so fair to some of the early sign-ups, right? Or anger at potential alternative explanations, right? So essentially people who signed up earlier but get delayed, right? May become very angry about this whole process, and they can actually spread their anger in their dorm rooms, right? And so altogether they decided to abandon the technology, right? So maybe some survey results might be helpful here. And another thing I was just thinking about is what is the prescription, right, or takeaway, right, from this research for companies, right? Like should the companies, like in that case, make their new technology available to everybody as when it's launched, right, in order to like avoid delaying some of the early adopters? But then if you look at the practices in the real world, right? If you look at Google's practice with Gmail, right? So some of the people who are really interested in Gmail couldn't get it at the very beginning because you needed to receive an invitation from a friend or Google employee, right? If you look at Nintendo's practice with Wii, right? So some people actually argue Nintendo was actually creating artificial shortage at the beginning, right? To create this hype, right? So actually, that actually made Wii a very successful product, right? So how does this research reconcile with these practices, right? So under what conditions companies should avoid delaying these earliest adopters, right? Under what conditions companies can actually strategically delay their adoptions and eventually make the product more successful? There might be some boundary conditions. I don't think your research will be able to kind of really tease out these boundary conditions, but it might be useful at the end of the paper to like speculate, right, a little bit, right, given the other work that has already been done, right? So two minor comments about the regressions, right? In the regressions, in addition to interacting with the early this delayed dummy with early adopter dummy, right? You do have a bunch of other control variables here. So I was just thinking that it might be useful actually to throw in like all these interactions with all these other control variables to see what other new insights you can discover, right? Yeah. So for instance, for like people who are new to Bitcoin, if you delay them, right, do they react? Right, or do they react even stronger, right? And also, like in the regressions, I think you used both OLS models and logit model. That's really helpful. But most of the discussions about this coefficient, magnitude of the coefficients are based on this logit model. I would actually do it based on this OLS models, simply because like when you have interaction terms in logit models, they are actually difficult to interpret directly. Yeah. So these are all my comments, and great paper again. Yeah. So looking forward to read the third version if there is one going to be one. Yeah.
Here is Christian for a reaction.
Oh, no, this is, thanks so much for reading it once more. I mean, it's like great comments. Just a few responses. So, on the, I think you raise a really good point about the caching out and comparing it to activity. We can do that. So, in a sense, we know that those people don't come back. We're able to track them even if they create a wallet later or if they do something else. But I think we need to bring it in the paper more directly, like showing a regression with activity. So we'll do that. I think your explanation about disappointment anger is actually consistent with how we think about the process. I guess the only tweak to that is that early adopters seem to be more disappointed than the others. So there's something about even like, and the wait list is not a huge difference, right? So we only gave them 5 days. So usually between the top 25% and the next batch is maybe a day difference in the sign up. So it's not a really long difference on that. I really like your idea of, speculating and thinking more about practical implications of this. And, we can't generalize much because of course this is a very idiosyncratic setting. But I think on what's different here is this idea that firms usually think about rollouts like Gmail as driven by capacity constraints. So the reason why Gmail was kind of rolled out slowly is because the size, it was I think 2 gigabytes at the time, was like impressive, right? It was unseen before. If anything, this paper points to there's value in a staggered rollout potentially also when there's not a technological capacity reason. And I guess the boundary condition would be, when do early adopters really care about exclusivity, right? When do they get utility from being the first one for a few months or a few weeks or whatever that time is? The other, I think, interesting insight is that if we were to do this again, I think what we learned is that if you're able to identify early adopters first and seed the technology to them, often they show up, right? So in many cases, they just show up at your door, and so you kind of identify them by review preferences. But in cases where that doesn't happen, think about a government push to impose, a good new technology or something, a procedure in healthcare. You could imagine that identifying those individuals that will get utility from having early access, because maybe that, is part of their reputation within their network, could help. Yeah, but thank you so much. Those are all great ideas.
What's your speculation about when these sort of behavioral factors, for lack of a better term, might matter? I mean, so you had like this V. grillicus seed adoption. I mean, it probably doesn't matter there, right? You talked to, here, it clearly seems to like, I mean, can you just like sort of speculate aloud a little bit, like when you think it might matter and when not? Again, I know you can't really test it, but I'm just sort of curious.
No, that's a really interesting question, and I shouldn't speculate. I mean, I'm not at the stage in my career, but I mean, yeah. So I think when you think about a lot of the sociology literature on the diffusion of technologies, I think would argue that even when you don't see immediate effects that are driven by economic forces, that there's like if some of these farmers, are kind of leaders within their communities in the adoption of new products, and they reap some benefits from that position. Could be because they get discounts or like whatever the market structure is. Then it's not clear that it wouldn't apply even in a setting that's a bit more dry than this. But it's clear that I think the setting that this is closest to is something where you have consumers and you have something that's really visible, right? Think about a smartphone potentially. And also that these consumers do care about that device or whatever it is as part of their identity or role in society. I think when you talk to early adopters, this resonates with them in terms of like how they think about the world. And often, when somebody that can get their iPhone in the first batch, then they're like, oh, I'll just wait for the next iteration at this point if I've lost that period of excitement or whatever it is. But yeah, I think it's an open question.
So is that possible if you rerun the experiment with another, technology, for example, some technology is obvious or it is easy for other people to identify whether that people have that kind of technology or not? Because even you have the Bitcoin, but it is not easy for your friends or your other friends to know that you have holding it or you can just crash out. So is that possible if you rerun the experiment with in another settings? I don't know whether the result will be kind of different or the result will be reinforced.
Yeah, that's a good point. Visibility is something that we speculate on, but we can't really observe. If anything, this is a technology that in regular setting would be almost invisible unless you ask someone. At MIT, given a lot of the culture around cryptocurrencies and privacy, it's something that people talk a lot about. So I wouldn't be surprised if they did discuss, I got it, I didn't get it. But I don't think we'll ever get the money. In fact, we didn't get it this time, right? So the students did it. So the credit goes to them. We just, tagged along in trying to answer some questions. But yeah, that's for further research. Thank you.